it needs to be said in the whole context of what I call liberal Protestant drift of the ELCA. And I was tempted to spend my whole time on analyzing where we are. But of course, many of you know that story already, and all I'd be doing is kind of confirming what you already know. But I did want to spend at least a third of the paper on that, what I call the present situation, and then share with you in the second section the section on homosexuality that's going to be in the second edition of my book called Ordinary Saints, and then thirdly to make a conclusion. So let's just take off from there. You all ought to have before you a copy of the paper, and I hope there are extra copies at the entrance that people can get that come in late. Russ, we had quite a problem with breakfast this morning, and many people probably didn't get breakfast. Okay, the present situation, and I call the paper The Limits of Tolerance, Homosexuality, and the ELCA's LPD, Liberal Protestant Drift. Not with a bang, but a whimper describes how mainstream Protestant seems to be ending. True, the various mainstream denominations still exist at the beginning of the 21st century, but I suspect there won't be much left of them by mid-century. They may be gathered into one Protestant Church of America, PCA, but the mergers will take place out of weakness rather than strength. They simply don't have enough clarity about, confidence in, and zeal for the gospel, the full Trinitarian faith, to replenish their own membership from within or to gain enough converts from without. The societal pressures on religious traditions to accommodate to a highly individualistic postmodern culture will be enormous. We know that we're facing them. As H. Richard Niebuhr warned many years ago in his Christ and Culture, those traditions who once maintained a strong tension between the transcendent Christ and the immanent culture will find themselves slowly moving toward the Christ of culture camp. Only the strongest traditions will survive with their identity intact as our culture exerts pervasive pressure to accommodate to it. The others, such as the various liberal Protestant denominations, will decline and probably merge. If you can get from the culture what you get in the church, why belong to a church? For a long time, we Lutherans believed we were different, and I grew up with that sense that we were different. Quite a few non-Lutheran scholars and national commentators thought so too. After all, we had a strong confessional tradition, a robust heritage and practice of theological reflection, a liturgical tradition, and a strong sense of identity and loyalty, partly due to our ethnic character. Lutherans had great affection for their churches. Throughout the post-war 40s, 50s, and 60s, we grew in numbers and vitality. But the scene is very different today. We no longer have the confidence that we are different. A number of our brightest lights have gone to other more stable traditions. Our confessional tradition is fairly irrelevant. Our theological reflection has broken into 1,000 voices. Our sense of loyalty and identity is weak, and we are aging and declining. We congratulate ourselves in finally joining our social betters, the Episcopalians, the Presbyterians, the United Church of Christ, in their loss of clarity, confidence, and zeal for the gospel. The combined Protestant church in America looks like it's just around the corner. How do we account for this merger into the mainstream? As I have suggested, a great deal of it is due to the enormous pressures for accommodation with the culture. These are enormous. But we have given additional punch to these pressures by our own self-conscious actions. We have aided the deconstruction of the Lutheran tradition by adopting the ideas and practices of elite liberal culture. Foremost among them is our adoption of a left-wing scheme of representation that ensured inclusivity, quote, unquote, by quotas. Inclusivity is the central theme of the ELCA from the beginning and still is now. However, inclusivity is not Catholicity, which would mean a concerted effort to evangelize many kinds and types of people and invite them to work their way into the leadership of the church. Who would not be for such Catholicity? No, inclusivity means a scheme of representation that makes all committees, boards, councils, and faculty subject to the percentages of minorities and designated oppressed groups we would like to have in the church, not the ones we have in the church. It aims at equality of results measured by those percentages. It is radically skeptical in that it assumes that racist, sexist Lutherans simply will not do the right thing electing or appointing people. It's radically condescending to minorities in assuming that they cannot make leadership gains on their own, and radically optimistic in the conviction that people turned up by the quota system will be Lutherans, who are deeply embedded in the vision and ethos of Lutheranism. The architects of this scheme wanted to diminish the authority of the white males who carry the theological DNA of Lutheranism and to open it up to many other voices. Inclusivity and diversity were meant to invade theology as well as representation, and they have. This virus has been deeply driven into the fabric of the ELCA. It has turned the church into a chaotic cacophony of voices, none of them particularly authoritative. We have become a model of interest group liberalism. Theologians are viewed as one interest group among many, and the theologians who are honored are ones who exalt the gospel without the law. And this next sentence is important. Since we have cut ourselves off from the authority of past churches, the theological and moral traditions we have held to be authoritative are now reduced to the same level as the many voices we have invited into the conversation. There is little orthodoxy to overthrow. However, the effect of inclusivity has not been neutral, ideologically speaking. Theological revisionism and social and political liberalism characterize the official organs of the ELCA, partly because only revisionists and liberals accept the idea of quotas and can therefore be selected, but partly because inclusivity has not been expanded to include theological traditionalists and social and political conservatives. One only has to look at the drift of Augsburg Fortress Press. I'd like to tell you the story of my latest skirmish with Augsburg Fortress Press, but it would take too long. Look at the drift of the Lutheran, who has fired Marva Dawn because she is too orthodox. Yes, she's been released. She predicted it to me in February when we were on a program together, that she anticipated that she would be let go. They told her her writing had no power. So look at the Lutheran, look at the hijacking of the women of the ELCA, look at the Lutheran Office of Governmental Concerns or Affairs, the ELCA Church Council, Church and Society, global mission events, many of our seminaries, campus ministry on secular campuses, and our own bishops' recent statements to get an accurate picture of the liberal Protestantizing of our church. The sacred topics of Protestant liberalism pervade our doings as much as, say, the Episcopalians. Now, to be fair, however, it is important to note that some attempts at recentering several of these expressions of the church have been made, and we should encourage them. Roy Harrisville is trying to recenter Fortress on Lutheran themes, and I believe John Stummy is a fair-minded Orthodox Lutheran in church and society. So these people, and I'm certainly not trying to be exhaustive in my analysis here, but there are good signs that we have to encourage. While this drift, liberal Protestant drift, is irritating, if not alienating, it has been tolerated by most of us. After all, there are many good parishes and people within the ELCA. The Lutheran Network provides a circle of Christian friends and institutions that are dear to me, make it impossible for me to leave. We are still a Christian church, so we cope. For example, I have adopted 2 coping methods to fend off further alienation. I no longer get the Lutheran, and I utterly refuse to go to another church-wide assembly. 1989 was quite enough for me, thank you. So I, like many of others, and you, have reluctantly tolerated the LPD of the ELCA. But on these issues of sexuality, we have come to the limits of toleration. True tolerance, as I will suggest later, does not mean limitless elasticity. It includes notions of endurance and forbearance. When certain limits are exceeded, tolerance cannot forbear or endure any longer. I believe that the proposals to bless homosexual unions and ordain homosexuals in committed relationships strain the level of tolerance for Orthodox Christians. Even the fact that the ELCA is taking these proposals seriously raises the level of our alienation from the ELCA. I had hoped they'd never come to this point. I don't like to talk about these things. Can such settled Christian moral teachings really come under serious questioning? Can they actually be voted on in assemblies? But were the ELCA to accept these proposals, their acceptance would do more than increase our alienation or strain our tolerance. Acceptance would raise the issue of status confessionis for many of us. Acceptance would constitute a frontal assault on the core meanings and values of the Christian faith. Acceptance would involve the denial of the basics of the Trinitarian faith, not just a difference of opinion. Acceptance would mean a rejection of the commandments of God, and that cannot be tolerated.